Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to break down the tragic and incredibly complex events that took place in Iran back in January of 2026. It's a story that starts with protest and ends in a brutal, state-led crackdown.
So, let's just jump right into the heart of it. We're talking about this one specific moment in time when these massive demonstrations, which were really fueled by all sorts of economic and political frustrations, were met with just an overwhelming and incredibly lethal show of force.
To really get a handle on what happened, and more importantly, why it happened, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the massacre itself, then rewind to see how the protests even started. We'll look at the devastating human cost, the methods the state used to crush dissent, unpack some of the powerful language used to describe it, and finally, see how the world responded to it.
All right, first up, what exactly went down on those two critical days in January? Let's get into the specifics of the event that turned protest into tragedy. Now, according to a ton of reports from the ground, this was not your standard crowd control, not even close. We're talking about a coordinated, violent suppression. You had security forces, including the Basij militia, that's a volunteer paramilitary force, and even elite Revolutionary Guard units deployed, and they reportedly used extreme lethal force. We're talking mass shootings right into crowds of people, and there were even reports of heavy weaponry being used against civilians.
And then you read something like this. This account from an eyewitness at the Rasht Bazaar, it's just devastating. This quote really paints a chilling picture. And it moves us beyond just abstract numbers, right? It grounds us in the terrifying, awful reality that people were facing on the ground.
So of course, that brings up the question, how did things get this bad? How did the nation get to this absolute breaking point? Let's dig into the roots of this uprising and see what sparks ignited such a massive movement.
And this timeline, wow, it really lays out just how fast everything spiraled out of control. It all started in late December 2025 with protests over the economy. But just weeks later, by early January, the demands had totally mushroomed into calls for fundamental political change. That really set the stage for the violent clash that happened on January 8th and 9th.
And this is such a key point to understand. It all started with economic desperation. People were fed up with high inflation, no jobs. But that initial spark just caught fire. It transformed into this fundamental challenge to the regime itself, with people demanding an end to the clerical leadership's grip on power. It became about so much more than just the economy.
Okay, this brings us to a central and frankly chilling question that's at the very heart of what became an information war. Exactly how many people were killed?
So first, let's look at the official number that came from the government in Tehran. They reported a death toll of around 3,000. Now, it's really important to note that while they were releasing this number, state-controlled media was also pushing a narrative, labeling the protesters as terrorists to try and justify the government's response.
But then you have this number, and it tells a completely different story. Independent advocacy organizations, trying to piece together all the reports from the ground, came up with estimates as high as 43,000 people killed. Verifying this is, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult, mostly because the government deliberately shut down the internet during the crackdown, creating this total information vacuum.
And this chart just puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? I mean, just look at that chasm between the numbers. This isn't just a small disagreement. We're looking at two completely different realities being presented. On one side, the official government story, and on the other, reports from activists and human rights groups suggesting something far, far worse.
And the violence that we saw in the streets was really just one piece of the puzzle. It was all part of a much bigger, much more systematic campaign designed to to crush dissent from every possible angle.
When you look at these steps laid out here, you can see it's a clear and deliberate playbook. It starts with lethal force, sure, but it doesn't end there. You shut down the internet so the world can't see what's happening. You conduct mass arrests to clear the streets. Then you use forced confessions to create your own narrative. And finally, you intimidate the families of the victims to silence the truth about who was killed. It's a comprehensive strategy for control. Now, you may have heard the term Iranian Holocaust being used in connection with all of this. So let's take a second to unpack what that label means, where it even came from, and why the language we use to describe these things is so significant.
So the key thing to get here is that this is not a formal, legal, or even an academic designation. It's a term that was really born out of the shock and horror on social media and in some news reports. It was used as a metaphor. People were reaching for a word that could somehow convey the sheer scale and the brutality of the killings. And this distinction is so critical. On one side, you have the informal, emotional language of activism, meant to convey the feeling of a worst-case atrocity. But on the other side, you have these precise, legally defined terms like massacre, which is what international bodies like the UN use. And that term, well, it requires rigorous, independent verification and has specific legal thresholds.
So, with this level of violence being reported, and with this staggering disputed death toll, how did the international community react to everything that was unfolding in Iran?
While the global response was pretty widespread condemnation. The UN Human Rights Council held emergency sessions and called for investigations. We saw major solidarity protests in cities all over the world, like New York and Los Angeles, and human rights organizations were relentlessly pushing for independent monitors to be allowed into the country. The biggest challenge, of course, remains actually gaining that access.
And this is the difficult reality of where things are today. The story isn't over. Information coming out of Iran is still extremely restricted. And for thousands of families, the search for truth, for justice, and for their missing loved ones just continues in this agonizing information blackout.
And that really leaves us with this final, vital question that underscores the ongoing challenge, not just for the people of Iran, but for the entire international community. When the facts are buried and access is denied, what does the path to justice and accountability even begin to look like?